This watercolor took me less than 10 minutes to do, and it has changed how I approach painting watercolor landscapes. Now, not this specific painting, but the exercise that I'm going to show you today. We all want to paint more loosely in our watercolors, but the thing is, you can't really get the results unless you specifically practice to paint loosely. And this exercise today does exactly that. It's good fun, as I said, less than 10 minutes. And we don't even need a pencil or do any drawings. We're just going to look at simplifications, values, and shapes, and let color, pigment, and water do all the heavy work. At the end of this video, you'll have a simple exercise you can do anytime, takes less than 10 minutes, and it will definitely help you loosen up with your watercolors. And if you find this a useful exercise, I got plenty more of those. I have a weekly newsletter where I send out one exercise a week that touches on different skills and techniques around watercolor. Links in the description. Thanks for watching, and let's get going. So my reference is a river scene, and I'm going to use a pretty big mop to get started. Now, we're not going to worry about the figure in this particular photo. That might be something we would add in a more detailed painting. I'm starting with a very watery wash of raw sienna. This is taken on a hot and dry summer's day, so we're going to keep it quite warm and high key. And I'm not even bothering with a sketch. That's also part of this exercise. Don't start drawing because you lose that spontaneous freedom that you have when you just use your watercolors to create your composition. That's why we choose a pretty simple photos with very strong shapes and not a lot of detail. I'm just going to drop in a bit of green for the bank and some of the foliage that's going to come in later, and the water of the river. And we're not going for realism ever in this painting. We're going for shapes and colors and temperatures and textures. So that's why I'm picking up a bit of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna to create a cooler color for the rocks that are in the foreground and there in the shadow. Work with the biggest brush that you are comfortable with so that you can get a lot of pigment and water onto your composition. I'm just adding a bit of stronger pigment here, and you can see we're already starting to create some texture. And I'm gradually adding stronger pigment to my composition. The same rules obviously apply for wet and wet. As you drop in more and more color, you need to add less and less water so that the shapes are starting to hold, and also that we don't lose all of our values when it dries. If it's really wet, then it's going to dry a lot lighter. Make no mistake, I'm making things up as I go along. I have no plan for this painting. I'm just glancing at my reference here and there and just gauging the values. Where does it need to be a bit darker, a bit lighter, a bit warmer, a bit cooler? And above all, I'm trying to have fun. I'm trying to be as experimental as I can and paint in a different way than I would approach my paintings usually. And as soon as the paint settles in an area and I feel like I can add stronger values to it, I will. I will paint for as long as I can in this first wash before I let it dry. Because once it's dry, we're going to be too tempted to add detail and realism into it. So I want to push this in this abstract phase as far as I can. I'm just going to lift off that big puddle there because that's the riverbank and I want to create a straight edge. And I've also switched to a smaller brush so that I have less water on the brush as I put pigment down. With big brushes, there's obviously the risk that you have a lot of water in them and you dump more water. I'm now getting to the stage where I want this to settle so that I can layer on more definitive shapes and they don't wash out as much as they do right now. It's going to drop in some of the shadows that the trees are casting. And then I've let this settle for a few minutes. It's still wet, but it has settled a bit into the paper. So now I can scratch out some highlights on my rocks. You can see it's so wet, it doesn't lift a lot of pigment off, just enough to create a bit of texture. But I'm keeping it also very simple. And you can see in the top right corner, it is still very shiny. So there's a lot of moisture still on the paper. But I'm going to start with my trees. I'm mixing a thick and dry dark color. And I just drag that in, well knowing that these will diffuse quite dramatically. This is the opposite of dry brushing. I'd still consider this wet in wet. Well, I'd say wet in damp. To be precise, okay, just speed this along a bit, a few flicks of the other trees and a bit of shadow at the base. And then I'm going to drop in the reflections straight away as well. That river is probably a little bit drier than the riverbank. As you can see, the reflections, they don't fuzz as much. They're a little bit more defined, but that's fine. You also drop in some of the foliage at the top so that that can fuse with the tree trunks. And you can see how much the trees have already dispersed. So it's going to drop in more of the pigment. Very strong, very dry pigment. One more and one more, and this one and that one. And I'm going to use our palette knife again and just scratch out some highlights on those trees. And you could obviously experiment with anything else as well, like salt, or wrapping paper or cling paper, whatever you can find. These are the exercises, those little paintings where you can just absolutely go to town. I always like to splatter, no matter what painting I'm doing. So no exception here. Big fat droplets. Then we're gonna lift off a few areas with the tissue to create some highlights. And I'm just gonna drop in a bit of quinacridone gold for some warmth on those trees. I let this sit for a few minutes again, just so that the water can evaporate a bit off the surface. Because those trees are definitely not strong enough. You can see they have almost completely disappeared into the background. So it's going to do it again. And this time it's going to hold because the background is dry enough for the thick paint to stay in place. It's going to add in a few more twigs and branches as well. And it's time to fortify the shadows. And we're building layers, which is nice. So it gives us a lot of depth in the painting. But I got to constantly remind myself not to become too realistic and start painting too much detail into this. I want to keep it as a very rough shapes and brush marks without much definition. The rocks have also almost dried in the meantime. I'll just add some dark shadows just to anchor the painting as well and to give those rocks a bit more definition. And that's all we need to do. And here is the finished piece when it's dry. And I think it's quite a successful little painting. Very quick, very expressive. And you just let the pigment do all the work. Hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching.